Good evening, everybody, and welcome to BrisScience for May 2024. I am your MC this evening, Joel Gilmore. It is nice to be back after missing last month. And thank you so much for coming. If this is your first time, welcome. BrisScience is a lecture series brought to you by the University of Queensland, where we aim to bring not just the best researchers, but also some of the best communicators to share their work and the cutting edge things that we're working on in Brisbane with the rest of the community and everybody watching online. Hello. Of course, I would like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting tonight, and for those watching online, watching tonight, and pay my respect on behalf of BrisScience to elders past and present. And tonight we are going to be talking about journeys and pathways, and so it's an opportunity afterwards to reflect on that 60,000-year journey that some of the First Nations people of Australia have in their long history, and what it means for us as we try and facilitate and unlock the incredible contributions of those First Nations people to Australia in the past and going forward. So tonight, we'll introduce our speaker in a moment. A little bit of housekeeping, first of all. If you have a mobile phone on you, which I imagine most of you do, great opportunity to turn it to silent. However, don't put it away, because we are going to be taking questions tonight using this very conveniently timed QR code here. So you can scan that code, get a page where you can ask questions throughout the talk, or there'll be time at the end. And after the presentation, we'll go through as many of those questions as possible. But if your question doesn't get asked, and I apologise in advance, there is a chance to chat with our speaker afterwards, and we're going to be having some food and drink outside. We would love for you to hang around, socialise with each other, with the speaker, with us, and talk about the science of tonight and more. This should be a good social opportunity for everybody. All right. I think that is everything. So tonight, I'm very excited to welcome our speaker, Dr. Evelyne Deplazes. Evelyne is a computational chemist at the University of Queensland, which means she blends detailed computer simulations of molecules with actual lab experiments to understand how molecules behave and interact. And something we've touched on in a couple of previous BrisSciences, particularly talking about AI and the way that computers are changing molecular design and simulation. So tonight, Evelyne is going to be taking a deeper dive into this world and talking about how we can use this computational chemistry to create new drugs, medicinal drugs. I don't think we're talking about a high-tech Breaking Bad here. I'm reasonably confident. Although, stay tuned, who knows? But we're also going to be talking about some of the journeys of scientists, and Evelyne will be sharing a little about her career pathway and some of the ups and downs on that path. So to set up the scene tonight and to take us on this journey of computational chemistry and more, could you please put your hands together and welcome Dr. Evelyne Deplazes.
Right. Welcome everyone, and thank you very much for coming tonight. I've been to a couple of BrisScience talks myself, so I'm used to sitting there, not standing up here. As my title says, from high school dropout to computational chemist. And so my talk today is a story in two parts. And the first part is probably a bit unusual or not very common for a science talk. So the first part is really about my career journey and how I got to be a computational chemist here in Australia. The journey started in Europe, where I was born. And then the second part is about my research. It's about combining supercomputers or HPC clusters and wet lab experiments to understand how molecules interact with each other. And in my particular case, I use this to find new drugs or pharmaceutical drugs, treatments for fungal and bacterial infections. And so before I start to talk about my journey, how I became a computational chemist, I would like to acknowledge that everyone's journey is different. There is something called survivor bias, and that is very much the case in how you become an academic. I would say don't listen to an academic on how to become an academic. You might want to talk to some people that wanted to be one and decided later that that was not for them. And so I think it's the same thing with my career journey and the mental health struggles I had on the way to get there, that everyone's journey is different. This just happens to be mine. And as you can see here in this little diagram of a person in the middle, in the circle, there is a lot of factors that play into what journey you take. I had a lot of challenges on the journey, but I had a lot of privileges and opportunities as well. And everyone's journey is different, so I usually try to instill to my students that the best thing at the end is to follow your own path. Doesn't mean you become a self-centered egotist, or at least I'd like not to promote that. But it does mean to constantly reevaluate what works for you and what doesn't work for you, and maybe navigate the journey that way. And for those of you in the audience who might be students, or not just in the audience but listening live, who might be students or who might be thinking about doing a PhD one day, I would like to very much emphasize that doing a PhD does not mean you have to become an academic. In fact, I'm very proud that most of the students that did their PhD under my supervision are not academics. And I think you can use your skills that you learn in a PhD in a wide variety of careers that are very fulfilling. So I just thought that's important for me to emphasize, that doing a PhD doesn't mean you have to become an academic. If you do want to become one, you're more than welcome, and I enjoy my job very much, but it was a long journey to get here. And so let's start with that journey and start at the beginning. I was born in Switzerland. I grew up in a town called Dietikon, which is about 20 kilometers outside of Zurich, in the German-speaking part of Switzerland. So I grew up speaking Swiss German, and then at school, High German. And so some of the photos that you can see here are obviously not from a town outside Zurich, if you know something about Switzerland. They're actually from the Swiss mountains. I was very fortunate that I also spent a lot of my childhood in a very picturesque village called Grindelwald. My mother was born in this village, and I spent many of my school holidays wandering these mountains. And like most children, completely unaware of the beauty around me. Like now I see Australian children not really being aware of the beaches they have. I was like that with those mountains. I really didn't appreciate the extraordinary uniqueness of these mountains when I grew up in. But now, when I do go back and visit my family in Switzerland, I am very much aware of these mountains. And so I do spend still quite a lot of time in that area of Europe. And so, if you read my little abstract or introduction to my talk, you might realize that not all was well. When I grew up, I had my fair share of health challenges. So when I was 13, I developed anorexia, and I went to hospital for about a month. And this is the first time, well, not the first time, but the first time I would like to emphasize where the privilege kicked in. I was born in Switzerland, and Switzerland has an incredibly excellent healthcare system. It has a very excellent public school system and a social welfare system. And so while my family didn't have a lot of money and was very much working class, I had access to incredibly good treatment. And so when I went to hospital at 13 with anorexia, I was also assigned a psychiatrist, and I went back to school and did reasonably well. I passed the entrance test to go to high school, so the Swiss system works a bit different. You have to pass an entrance test to get into high school, which I passed. And then when I was about 16, I really wasn't well at all. My anorexia had developed into bulimia. I also had severe body dysmorphia issue, which is essentially a distortion of how you see your body and a sense of not being at ease at all in your body, where you really feel quite foreign to everything that is your physical appearance. And it often comes together with eating disorders. I also had severe PTSD. And so together with my health, with my psychiatrist and my GP, I decided to enter into a psychiatric clinic for 4 months. And so I was 16, I was just about to turn 16, and I spent 4 months with excellent care. It was an open facility where I could go home on the weekend, and during the week I had all sorts of therapies, from art therapy, group therapy, individual therapy. Was also, the clinic happened to be next to a forest, so I was able to spend a lot of time walking through the woods, and I got quite well. I was a lot better, and but I decided that after the treatment, well, a social worker that I was assigned and my healthcare team decided that it was probably better for me not to return home. So remember, I was only 16, but sometimes with mental health issues in teenagers, sometimes it's hard to go back to the normal to your usual environment, and then that also makes it hard to not fall into the old patterns again. So sometimes it might help if a teenager decides to not go back home. And in my case, that is again where I was very fortunate that in Switzerland the social welfare system is quite good, and so I was provided with a sort of a living allowance by the government. I was living in social housing where there were social workers that helped me and other teenagers with issues at home or with health issues to just go by everyday life. And so I returned to high school. And I did quite well in high school. I loved my science. I loved studying in general. I always loved school. But when I was about 18, I relapsed and I was really bad again. And so I decided that I was time to go back to the psychiatric clinic. So I was 18, and yet there I was for the second time in my short life, or then short life. I was in a psychiatric clinic again. And at the end of that turn, at the end of that stay, I decided I didn't really want to return to high school because it would have meant doing that particular year for the third time. And I didn't really want to do that. And so I decided that, okay, I need to do something else. And I had access to career advice or career counseling for teenagers. And I always loved anything to do with STEM, or science, technology, engineering, and math. I also happen to love engines and cars. Now, these days, it's probably more the motorbikes that I tend to really like, but back then it was definitely the cars that I really liked. And so I decided to become a car electrician. So I spent 2 years doing an apprenticeship as a car electrician. And then, during those 2 years, I also realized I really like the logistics around spare parts. That sounds maybe a bit strange to people, but I think in hindsight it was because I really like numbers, and I like organizing things, and I like logic. And so the idea to learn about systems on how one spare part for a particular car makes its way from its manufacturer somewhere in Asia all the way to your car somewhere in the world and gets put into that car by the mechanic, I found that fascinating. I also liked the idea of having some exposure to customers, because in that particular apprenticeship, you didn't just organize the spare parts for the mechanics and the electricians and the other people working in the workshop. You also had customers walking in and wanting to buy new tires or new snow chains for their cars going on their skiing holidays. And I also liked that part where I could interact with customers. And as part of that second apprenticeship, which took another 2 years, I also went to school, back to school, or the equivalent of TAFE, I suppose, in Australia, and did a business admin diploma. Because I realized that I really like working in technology and engineering fields, but I also liked the idea of working more in project management. So after I finished my 2 apprenticeships and got my business diploma, I got some work as a technical project assistant, first for an engineering company, and then for an IT department in a bank. It is Switzerland after all, so I did end up working for a bank. But something else that happened during my time as a car electrician and in the logistics of spare parts is that I met my partner, who was also a motor mechanic at the time. And that was 25 years ago now, and he still is my partner to this day. I was 21. He was also born and raised in Zurich, but a few years before we met, he had immigrated to Australia. And so at 21, and then a bit later at 24, I decided to pack my bags and literally pack my bags or pack my boxes and move from Zurich to Perth. And when I was in Perth, I had to reevaluate what I was doing because all my training was in Switzerland. I didn't really know what I wanted to do. I didn't really know what kind of job I would be doing in Australia. I haven't really thought about what I would do for work much, to be honest. And now in hindsight, that kind of feels a bit like, oh, I went to a different country at the other side of the world without my family, without thinking much what I would be doing for a living. But I suppose you don't think about that when you're in love and you just think it's exciting to move to Australia. And there was a chance encounter, actually, where we had dinner with our neighbors, and I'm pretty sure that these neighbors probably don't even remember having that conversation. But the woman in being my neighbor said, oh, I'm thinking about going back to university now that the kids are getting a bit older. And I was thinking, how can you go to university when you finished high school, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago? Because in Switzerland, it was, at least back then, it was not very common for adults to go back to uni and study maybe in their 30s. It was also not very easy to go to university if you didn't have that high school diploma. Remember, I'd never finished high school. And so I thought, oh, that's unusual. I've never met anyone in Switzerland, at least not in my family, that went to university in their 30s. And by then I was only 24, but I certainly didn't have that traditional entry to university. I had never finished high school, and I just didn't think it was possible. And somehow that conversation sparked something in me. Maybe it was because I had just moved to Australia and I was in this mindset of everything's possible. I'm in a new country. Let's do something different. And I was in Perth, so I went to the universities that you have in Perth, went to their student services and said, what do I have to do to study chemistry? Because that sparked in me that joy that I know I had when I did science back in high school. And I thought, well, maybe I could actually go back and become a scientist. And it turns out that I was able to sit what they call the STAT test, which is essentially an entrance test for people that don't go through the traditional pathway of going to university. It was a combination of English and quantitative questions, which is sort of a way of saying a bit of basic math and chemistry and biology. Now, the thing was that, or the catch was, because I was in Australia on a spouse visa, I wasn't actually treated as an international student. Now, on one hand, that's good, because it means I was able to access HECS. But on the other hand, it meant I had to sit that exam or entry exam to university as an Australian, and meaning I was assumed to have grown up speaking English, which I hadn't. So I did learn English in Switzerland in high school, but there's a difference between being conversational in a language and doing an entry exam for university. And so I got myself some year 11 and year 12 textbooks and spent about 2 months in the local library catching up on my science. That was by then about 6 years ago, since I was in high school. So I caught up on my science, but I was doing it in English. And I also studied a lot of grammar and how to write essays in English in a way that they ask for at year 12. Which turned out to be quite different than what the kind of English essays we wrote in Switzerland. But nevertheless, I passed, as you can guess, from my journey, I passed the entrance test. I scraped through the English. I did reasonably well in the quantitative part. And so I went to Curtin University and I studied a Bachelor of Chemistry and a Bachelor of Computer Science. And then I decided I really like research. I did a couple of research internships in my undergraduate degree. I did an honours in computational chemistry. And I really liked the idea of doing research, so I moved to the University of Western Australia, or as we like to say in Perth, the other university across the river. And that's where I did my PhD in computational chemistry or computational biophysics. And I had very much a wonderful time. I still love studying. I still love being at a university. But I definitely had a very good time as a PhD student. This is, I'm not sure whether this, yes, this laser works. This is me at my graduation. This is me submitting my thesis, which really is a great feeling if you do a PhD, because it's about after 4 years of really hard work. And this is us celebrating finishing our PhDs. But I've also put this here because it was not an easy journey in many ways. And doing a PhD is by all means not an easy feat to start with. But back then I started my undergraduate degree at 25. I was 30 when I started my PhD. I was still very much struggling with depression, complex PTSD. My eating disorders was definitely still on the agenda. But again, I was very fortunate that at both universities there was counselling services. And so I had access to some free counselling, and then through Medicare I had access to some more counselling. But it did also mean that as a student I spent a lot of my money that I earned from my stipend as well as from tutoring. I did spend a lot of that money on counselling. And it did mean that I had to prioritise my mental health during all my studies. So during my PhD, I took a 3-month interruption because I had a relapse of the depression and I was really not well and I couldn't keep up my studies. And so I really sometimes did feel like that little duck who was probably resembling something functional or maybe reasonably happy or content, but underneath I was peddling my little heart out. But I did learn very early, and this to raise my hand for help. And if I learned something good came out of having gone to psychiatric clinics in my teenage years twice, it was that I learned very quickly that if you put your hands up, there's usually people who are willing to help you. And also I learned very quickly that if you don't show up and do the hard work, you're not going to get better. And sometimes you do a lot of hard work and you still don't feel like you're getting better. And so it is really paddling. But over the years, I was slowly recovering. I was slowly getting better. And then I embarked on what we call the postdoctoral years. Now, some of you might not be familiar with the academic system, and so postdoc literally means post for after, doctoral for after your doctoral studies. And so the postdoctoral years are essentially a few years where you are a freshly minted PhD, you get to call yourself doctor, but yet you somehow still have not finished learning. And so you spend a few years working in the research group of professors, or mostly professors, and you continue your training. And it's very common for people that want to become academics to do this for a few years. And you often move around a lot during that time as well. And so I was a research fellow at the University of Queensland for 4 years. I then went back to Perth and I was a research fellow at Curtin University. And I then got a fellowship at the University of Technology, Sydney, where I became what we call a group leader, which essentially means I got to run my own research group. It also means I have to find my own money and apply for grants to do that research. So it's a bit like if you want to become an academic in Australia, the system is very much that you go through postdoctoral training, and if you decide to become an academic, at some stage you will probably become what we call a group leader. And if you decide to also do teaching, then you might start applying for position like lecturing position. And this is what I did. I was very fortunate that in 2021, in the midst of the pandemic, I was offered my senior lecturer position, which is where I'm still working now at the University of Queensland as a senior lecturer in biochemistry and chemistry, and as a research group leader. And along the way, again, I had, on one hand, was still working on my mental health. I was very much, at this stage, I was definitely in my 30s and then later in my 40s. And at this stage, I think I can say that I started moving from paddling my little heart out to just survive to having a sense of maybe thriving. And I think this is probably the most, the biggest achievement or biggest sense of achievement I ever had as being someone with mental health issues for 30 or 35 years now. And as someone that comes from a background of domestic violence and physical and sexual abuse and lots of trauma, to actually be going from something that feels like I am just hanging in there and surviving, to going, well, actually, most of the time life's okay. And I feel like I'm thriving. And I think that was, for me, it took me to my mid-30s and my 40s to get a sense of thriving. And that has nothing just to do with my career, but just in my life general. And I was also incredibly fortunate that I had some mentors that really helped me to redefine how I look at myself as an academic. And this is really about confidence, but it's also about mindset and that internal dialogue. And I think we're all familiar with that internal dialogue where you tell yourself things about yourself and how you see yourself and perceive yourself and what you think you are and what you think you're not. And that can really manipulate how you portray yourself. And I think for a very long time, I didn't realize how much my internal dialogue was probably sabotaging my own, I wouldn't say my career, but certainly how I looked at myself in my career. And I had some wonderful mentors, including Dr. Alison Rice here in Brisbane, which I met through Women in Technology, which is a Queensland organisation, and Professor Marie Jadeg, which I met through Franklin Women, which is an amazing organisation that was actually founded by someone who was a postdoctoral researcher in medical research and realised that there really is not a lot of mentorship, but also leadership development for women in STEM or women in science, that to help them build exactly that internal dialogue, the confidence, the leadership skills. When you do a PhD and your postdoctoral training, we get trained to become scientists. But at the end, many of us in academia end up running research groups. Now, there is a big gap between knowing what you're doing in the lab as a scientist and running a research group where you have other people working with you and you're supposed to lead them. So somehow you need to morph from being a scientist to being someone that leads people. And maybe some people do that naturally, but I think many of us don't, and we don't get any training for it. And so Melina Georgosakis founded Franklin Women as a social enterprise and runs wonderful mentorship programs that I was able to take part in. And so this brings me to the end of the first part, because now I am at University of Queensland, I'm a senior lecturer, so what do I actually do at the University of Queensland? Well, I combine supercomputers and wet lab experiments to find new drugs, or pharmaceutical drugs, to treat fungal and bacterial infections. Now, most of you, when you think of chemistry, you're probably thinking of, a laboratory, wet lab, as we call it. And so what is computational chemistry? I mean, the word implies it, but what does it actually mean? And so let's take a step back before we go to the computers. Now, when we talk about chemistry, we're talking about the molecular world. So we're talking about looking at understanding nature by studying atoms and molecules. Everything around you, everything you are, is made up of atoms and molecules. And when we study chemistry, we essentially try to understand the world around us as well as our own physical bodies through looking at how atoms and molecules interact with each other. And so I'm going to use a very simple example, I hope it's a simple example, that most of you hopefully can relate to, that sort of illustrates what I mean. And so why does ice float on water? So you can see this iceberg here floating on the ocean. Same thing goes, why do your ice cubes float in your iced tea? Why don't they sink to the bottom? And the reason for that is density. And so this looks like a scary plot, but it's actually quite easy. It's density versus temperature of water. You can see here, this is ice. Ice has a much lower density than liquid water. Now, if you have a lower density, it means anything with a lower density than liquid water, which includes ice, will float above the water. And so that is the explanation or the physical property that tells us why ice floats on water. You also notice there is a very sudden change around 0 degree, which we know that's when liquid water turns to ice. So there's a sudden jump here. Now, to explain this phenomena, it's enough to understand this density plot. But scientists rarely stop at one thing. We tend to always be like toddlers. Why? But why? So we keep asking why. So why is it that liquid water has a higher density than ice? And so we look at the molecules. Now, most of you would have done some science at some stage. This is water, H2O, has 2 hydrogens and 1 oxygen. So each of these balls is an atom. So you have 1 atom of oxygen and 2 atoms of hydrogens, and that makes up water. Now, if you want to understand the density of water or any substance, we can't just look at one molecule. We need to look at how do they interact with the molecules around them. Okay? So let's look at water, how it interacts with other water molecules. This is a very nice regular arrangement of how water looks like when it's ice. Very structured. That's how ice looks like at the bottom when it is liquid. Now, you can just by looking at this, without being a scientist or chemist, just by looking at this, you can appreciate that there's all these holes in here. So this material here, this arrangement of molecules, simply has a lower density. So it has less atoms or less molecules per volume than liquid water. And so understanding this arrangement of atoms helps us understand this plot, which means it helps us understand something we can observe in nature. And that's essentially what we do as chemists. We look at something we can observe in nature, and we try to explain it using atoms. Lots of experiments to study this arrangement, but simply that's what we do as chemists. Now you see, we don't stop here again. We go, why? Well, why is there a sudden jump? What happens when water goes at 0 degree and then all of a sudden changes its density to become ice? What is it, this sudden? A sudden change like this always intrigues scientists. And if we want to do this, we actually need to look at the motion of atoms. So far, we've been looking at static pictures, but that's not how chemistry or how nature works. Everything moves. And this is where computational chemistry becomes quite powerful. It is very hard to study atoms, to look at them. You can't actually look at atoms moving. It's very hard because they're incredibly tiny. And this is why I put this watching molecules dance in quotes. We can't really watch the molecules, or there's a very limited capacity to watch molecules because they are very tiny. But if we can come up with mathematical descriptions that explain or describe the interactions between atoms and therefore molecules, we can actually use computers to calculate how molecules behave. And that's essentially what computational chemistry does. The computer is simply a workhorse. It's simply a tool that allows us to calculate the interactions between atoms and therefore calculate properties like the density of water. But because you have to calculate so many interactions, you need supercomputers. So you cannot do the type of research I do on your laptop, maybe in 20 years. But at the moment, the kind of simulations that we do, if I would do this on my laptop with 8 CPUs, it would probably take about 6 to 12 months to get an answer for a very simple simulation. That's why we use supercomputers. So this is GARDI. This is part of NCI, which is the National Computational Infrastructure. This particular machine stands in Canberra. And you can only see a small part of this supercomputer. This is an entire room, probably about as big as this, and is filled with rows and rows and rows of CPUs. And that's what we use to do these simulations. But at the end of the day, the principle is quite simple. You need mathematical equations to describe the interactions between atoms, and that allows you to calculate properties. And if you can do it with water, you can do it with any kind of atoms there is. And that's essentially what we do in my research group. We use the same principle, but we apply it to biological systems. And so what you're looking at here is a molecular dynamics simulation. So that's essentially a lot of number crunching of how atoms interact with each other, of caffeic acid interacting with a model of a cell membrane. Now, you're probably thinking, what's caffeic acid and what's a cell membrane? And what does that have to do with drug development? Okay, let's take it step by step. Caffeic acid is this molecule. It's called a polyphenol. And some of you might have heard of polyphenols because they're incredibly powerful antioxidants. You've probably had 100 different types of polyphenols today, because you can find them in coffee, fruits, veggies, spices, honey, most things that are plant-based. And as you would guess, it's called caffeic acid because it is found in coffee. But you also find it in lots of other plant-based food. It has a very strong antioxidant, antimicrobial, and cytotoxic effects. So cyto means cell, toxic means toxic. So cytotoxic means it's toxic to certain cells. And you can probably now start to guess where we're going with the drug development for fungal and bacterial infection. And so antioxidants or antimicrobial compounds are compounds that can kill bacterial cells or fungal cells in a petri dish. That's essentially because the word antimicrobial means it's anti a microbe, and a microbe could be a bacteria or a fungal cell or a virus. Now that's the caffeic acid. And the other part in my simulation was the cell membrane. So the cell membrane is what you see here as this orange circle. And I'm a chemist, not a biologist. Like I like to tell my students, I don't know too much about biology, and that really is a fair assessment, because I'm really interested in cell membranes, which is that protective shell around the cell, and it controls what goes in and out of a cell. Now, I'm very interested in the cell membrane. Anything that's inside the cell, I don't know too much about, but I am very, very much an expert, and I'm very fascinated by cell membranes. Now, these cell membranes are semi-permeable. That means some things can go through and some things can't. And the reason this is important for drug development is because you can actually kill cells by damaging the cell membranes. And the analogy I like to use is a water balloon. Think of a big water balloon filled with some liquid. The cell is not that dissimilar in terms of the cell membrane. The balloon itself is the cell membrane, and the liquid inside is what lives inside the cell. What happens if I punch a hole into the water balloon? I've got some kids here. The water leaks out. Yes. In fact, We call this cell lysis, and lysis means stuff leaks out. Okay? So you can actually kill a cell in a very similar way as punching a hole in a water balloon. It's pretty cool, isn't it? And so nature has realized that the cell membrane is like an Achilles heel of a cell. If you damage the cell membrane and stuff gets out, the cell, most of the time the cell can't recover and the cell dies. And so there are compounds in nature that damage the cell membrane, make holes in it, stuff gets out, cell dies. And this is how some of these antimicrobial compounds work. Now, the membrane is made up of what we call lipids. They're little fat molecules. And this is why, as a chemist, I then start asking the question, why? So how is it that some of these compounds, how does that work? How do they attack the cell membrane and damage it so that stuff gets out of the cell and the cell dies? And that's essentially what we do in my laboratory. We use computer simulations as well as experiments to understand how do molecules get to the cell membranes, how do they damage the cell membrane, and what's the consequence of that for the cell? And sometimes that means the cell dies. And we can exploit that to make new antibiotics or new antifungal drugs, for example. And so the simulation that you saw a few slides ago, which was caffeic acid, that was from a project where we were looking at the antimicrobial effect of honey. Now, most of you would be aware that Manuka honey, for example, is very antimicrobial. Most of the antimicrobial activity of Manuka honey is due to MgO, or methyl glycoxyl. Not all of the activity, but most of it. But other honeys are actually also antimicrobial. We call them non-Manuka honey. So you can get, if the honey hasn't been heat processed and all the natural compounds are still there, many honeys have very good antimicrobial properties. And it turns out that some of these antimicrobial properties are actually related to exactly that mechanism that we study, the damaging of membranes. And so honey contains a lot of polyphenols, which are antioxidant, but they're also antimicrobial because they damage cell membranes. Now, that doesn't mean because you take a spoonful of honey into your stomach, it's going to damage your cell membranes, okay? It's a question of concentration. It's a question of things being diluted in your stomach. There's also pH 2, very, very acidic in your stomach. So there's all sorts of factors. But if you do treat a petri dish of bacteria with a 20% honey solution, those bacteria, or at least part of them, will not be able to continue to grow. So it's antimicrobial. And we then used computer simulations to understand how does the caffeic acid and other polyphenols found in honey, how do they interact with the lipid molecules that make up the cell membrane, and how does that relate to the cell-killing activity? And so you can see that there's this recurring theme of having a biological phenomena or biological process that I find fascinating. And then, as chemists, we look at it from the very molecular level. So I say, well, okay, the microbiologist tells me that the membrane's damaged. So what's a membrane made up of? Well, it's made up of lipids. So why don't we study how these lipids interact with these polyphenols to see whether we can explain the antimicrobial properties? And once you can explain a property of a molecule, you can then use this knowledge to try to come up with different or similar molecules that you might be able to use to make new pharmaceutical drugs. And most of you would have heard of antimicrobial resistance, or the scary thought that if we don't come up with new antibiotics in the next 10, 20, 30 years, we might be running down a very dangerous path because modern medicine relies on antibiotics. And so because we have an increase in antimicrobial resistance, there is a pressing need to find new antimicrobial drugs. And so understanding how natural antibiotic drugs work, or antimicrobial compounds work, can help us to find new antibiotic drugs. Now, the other thing that we do in my laboratory, which we currently work on, which I'm very excited and fascinated about, is so-called invasive fungal infection. Now, before I started this project, I wasn't really aware what invasive fungal infections were. I'm not a medical doctor, I'm not a biologist. And when I thought, or when I used to think of fungal infection, I used to think, oh, athlete foot, vaginal thrush, yeah, okay, can't be that bad. But turns out, well, these are superficial infections. Most of us are what we call immunocompetent. It means we have a very good immune system. If we get a fungal infection on our skin, our immune system is doing a really good job at preventing this infection from entering our bloodstream. But unfortunately, if you are immunocompromised, that might not work, and you get what's called an invasive fungal infection. It means the fungal infection has got into your bloodstream and starts attacking your organs. It's very similar to a bacterial infection in your blood that you would call sepsis, except it's not a bacteria, it's a fungal infection. And unfortunately, the mortality rates of these infections are very high. They're between 20 and 80%, depending on the pathogen, and that's in good healthcare settings in Australia. And most people that are affected by it are people that are immunocompromised. So people that undergo cancer treatment, HIV/AIDS patients, people that have received an organ transplant, or premature babies, or elderly patients that are immunocompromised. And because we've gotten so good at modern medicine, we actually have an increasing cohort, or an increasing number of people that live with a compromised immune system. So there's now an increase in invasive fungal infection. There is also an increase in resistance to the existing drugs. And so we've got this combination of more and more people dying of invasive fungal infection. In fact, it's 1.6 million people per year. And that is quite a staggering number. And particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, where HIV and AIDS is still a massive problem, most or many people that die of AIDS actually die of a fungal infection. And in Australia and other Western countries, fungal infections are a massive issue when you have immunocompromised patients, for example, someone undergoing cancer treatment. Unfortunately, the drugs that we use are very toxic. There's not much choice in terms of antifungal drug. There is not many drugs. And the drugs that we do use are very toxic. And the reason for that is that from a biochemical point of view, fungi and us are actually really similar. So there's not much difference in the genetics or biochemical makeup of a fungal cell and us. And so that means it's very hard to find a drug that kills the fungal cell but doesn't damage our healthy cells, our mammalian cells, our human cells. And so many of the drugs are very toxic. And so one of the most common drugs is called amphotericin B. And we work on a project with collaborators who have recently discovered a peptide called LFG, or lactofungin. And this peptide is quite remarkable because in itself, it doesn't kill fungal cells. It doesn't do anything to the fungal cells. But when you combine it with this drug, it makes the drug work better. Now, we don't know yet why. Somehow, this drug that is not antifungal makes an existing antifungal drug work better. Now, if you can make a drug work better, it means you might be able to use less of the drug, which means it might become less toxic as a treatment. So that's the hypothesis behind it. And so we're currently working on a project where we, again, combine the computer simulation, as well as the experiments we do in my laboratory, as well as the experiments we do with my collaborators who are biologists, and then try to understand how does this peptide interact with this drug, and how does this little peptide make this drug work better? Can we use this to indirectly come up with a treatment for fungal infection that is less toxic? And that's what we're currently trying to work on in my laboratory. And so with that, I hope that next time when you hear the word chemistry, you don't just think of a lab like this, which is what we call a wet lab, or I call a wet lab. But actually, chemistry is also this. You can do chemistry in computers because chemistry is about understanding how atoms and molecules interact with each other and how these molecular properties translate to what we see in nature or in a cell or in a rock if you're a geological chemist. It doesn't matter if you see a phenomena or a process in nature. If you can understand what the molecules that make up that system, what they do, if you can understand the interactions between the molecules, you can understand where this property arises from. And you can do this using wet labs, or you can do this using supercomputers. And we call them supercomputers because they have a lot of CPUs. So this particular machine, Gaudi, has about 250,000 CPUs. Now, your computer has about 8 or 16 CPUs. That's a lot of CPUs. And so that's essentially what supercomputers and chemistry have to do with each other. And so I would like to acknowledge the people that over the years have given me funding or jobs. I would also like to acknowledge the supercomputing facilities that we have access to in Australia, which is the National Computational Infrastructure, as well as PAWSI in Western Australia. And then I would like to acknowledge lots and lots of people that I will not individually name, but I was very fortunate to have incredibly good supervisors as a PhD student and as a postdoc. I have incredibly excellent collaborators that I work with, chemists, microbiologists, and clinicians that are, that are daring enough to work with a computational chemist. And I've been blessed with having loads and loads of really, really talented, students. I knew this would happen at some stage. I had wonderful students that I work with and collaborators, and most importantly, probably my mentors that I had over the years that helped me navigate my academic career path. And so with this, I would like to finish and re-emphasize that I believe you need to follow your own path, whatever that path is, and wherever that path may lead you. And I'm happy to take any questions. And yes, if in doubt, keep calm and do science.
Thank you so much, Evelyne. We are going to take some questions now. Could we just pop up that QR code again, just in case anyone didn't grab it before? There it is. So you can scan that to get the question app. We are, of course, here most months of the year. So we're back next month, and we have a really exciting talk by Professor Trevor Ireland talking about what are asteroids made of.
Atoms?
So it's going to be a fun astronomy-themed talk. So make sure you sign up to our mailing list, head to our website, follow us on X, formerly known as Twitter, etc., and we will keep you up to date on that. We already have a bunch of questions coming in, but let's go. I'll get you to sort of jump to the front of the stage there, so we've got great footage from our camera guy. Okay, so questions we have here. First question is from Yana, who says, how do we know that the simulation models are right?
We don't.
Okay, next question.
No, it's an excellent question, and it's a question we constantly have to ask ourselves. And so the magic word, or I wouldn't say magic word, but the key word is what we call validation. And so you do a simulation, and you calculate properties, and ideally what you do is you make a prediction. So you make a prediction about a property or a process that the experimentalists can test. Ideally something that they actually themselves haven't done the experiment on. And so, for example, if we're looking at drug development, we could be saying, look, I think if you make a small change to this molecule in that position, if the chemist makes this compound, we think this is going to be even better at damaging the membrane. Because we're looking at the atomistic interactions, we can really go down to the individual atoms and say, okay, if we change this compound just in a small way and put another oxygen and hydrogen there, or another carbon or another phosphate there, I think it will be a better drug. And that's a prediction. And then I have to convince a chemist to make that for me in the laboratory. And then I go back to the microbiologist and say, can you please test if that kills the fungal cells even better? If yes, great. If no, I go back to the drawing board. And that's what we call validation. I hope that answers the question.
Fantastic. Sort of building on some of this, let's stay in the quantum computing world. So Alejandro asks, how has the development of machine learning and artificial intelligence impacted your work?
So that's an excellent question, because it's actually impacting it as we speak really in the last few years. So one of the things that we have to do in computational chemistry is what we call parameterization. It's a fancy word that essentially means we have to come up with the mathematical equations that describe the interactions between the atoms. The way we do this has been quite manual. So we try to describe the interactions, we try to match it to properties that chemists and physicists have measured, and we manually go back and improve them in a cycle of matching experiment, going improving, matching experiment, going improving. That's quite laborious. And that's where machine learning has quite a massive impact in computational chemistry. So we now have massive data sets on properties, and machine learning can use these data sets to come up with different ways of coming up with these parameters. And that is a different way of how we do how we develop the equations to do computational chemistry. And there is people who now either people like me who have to learn machine learning, or there's the machine learning people that come to in our field of computational chemistry and come up with these new ways of describing the interactions, which hopefully then makes our simulations more accurate.
Great. Let's jump to fungus. Tsi Hui asks, is there any medical treatment for fungi? And who was it? Someone said, Leah says, more pointedly, I'm now terrified of fungus. What can I do to avoid infection? Okay, so let's start with the avoid infection. Like I said, invasive fungal infections are actually quite rare. So when you get them, they're dangerous, but they're rare. And they're particularly very rare if you are immunocompetent. And most of us are very lucky to be immunocompetent. Our immune system is incredibly good at defending ourselves from the invasion of fungi. So although you might get an athlete foot, you take a cream, you put it onto the maybe the fungal infected toenail, and within a few weeks the infection is cleared. But your immune system is also doing a job there, not just a drug. Your immune system is making sure that although you have an infected toenail, this does not go into your bloodstream. So it's really immunocompromised people. And this is, when you're immunocompromised, you are highly likely to be seeing a physician or medical doctor anyway, because you have an underlying health condition. And that physician or medical doctor will be very much aware that you are at risk of these infections and helps you take care. So there is no need to be scared of them any more than bacterial infection that you might pick up. In fact, they are much rarer, fungal infection, than bacterial infections. Amazing. Okay, last couple of questions. We've got some here from Grace and Bella, who ask, so Grace says, I'm an undergraduate physics student wondering if you need to have a PhD to work in research. And Bella says, what advice would you give to a year 11 student wanting to go down a similar career path? So perhaps if you could sort of, what advice to those looking to follow you?
So the first question was about, do you need a PhD to work in research?
Yeah.
I don't think you per se need a PhD to work in research. I mean, we have people at universities that are research assistants, that work at scientific offices, that help us prepare experiments for the teaching labs. Many of these highly skilled people have a degree, a bachelor's degree, honors degree, but they don't have a PhD. And so if you want to work in research, scientific research, that is, doing a Bachelor of Science is a good start. If you then go out into the workforce and you realize you enjoy research and you might want to do a PhD, that's another option. But just because if you want to work in research doesn't necessarily mean you have to have a PhD, no. If you want to have a career in academia, then yes, you very likely need a PhD, at least in science. It might be a bit similar, it might be a bit different in the humanities, where people sometimes have years and decades of industry experience and then get into academia like this. But at least in Australia and most in Europe and the US, if you want to become a research academic or a lecturer, then you have to have a PhD. And if you do year 11 and you want to study science, I would say good for you, yay, very happy about that. I would very much say that at the undergraduate level, I don't think it matters too much what science you do, as long as you do something you really enjoy. A degree is 3 or 4 years. It's quite hard. It takes a while to adjust to the life of university. It's a bit different from high school. So I think it's important that you do something you love, because that increases your chances of sticking with it and putting in the hard yards to get to your end of your degree.
Great. And I'm going to go one more question, because I think this is a really good one, which we haven't really talked about before, from Lisa. And something you talked about a couple of times was mentors. Lisa asks, how do you find excellent mentors?
Excellent question.
Lisa might be angling to have a coffee with you after this.
Right. So I can only speak of the academic setting. But I think there is similar programs in industry or government organizations. So essentially, there are organizations like Women in Technology and Franklin Women, for example, the RUCKI, which is the Association of Chemists in Australia. Many societies and organizations have mentoring programs. You sign up to the program and you get assigned a mentor. Now, sometimes that works out, and sometimes that doesn't work out. And I think it sometimes is a bit of luck and opportunity, but also trying multiple things. I've had mentors where it didn't really work that well. I had mentor programs where the program itself didn't work well. But most of these programs are excellent. Universities offer a lot of these programs. Companies offer them. Organizations, learned societies offer them. And then it's really about putting your hands up. And I think it's also about being open to work with that mentor. Sometimes it's very challenging to listen to what your mentor has to say. It sometimes feels a bit like being a teenager again and having your parents telling you what not to do or what to do. And listening to a mentor can sometimes be quite confronting, because you get some honest advice that you might not like. But I think finding a good mentor is about as much as you put into the relationship as much as you get out of it. And finding organizations can be as simple as contacting the HR. I don't know where the person asking the question works or is from, but if you're in a job, it can be as simple as contacting HR.
And being a little bit pushy sometimes, right? You
Yes.
get an email, sometimes
Yeah.
slip down the list, send a second email.
Send a second email. But I think a lot of the good mentoring programs are quite structured. So there is a group of mentors that sign up, and there's a group of mentees that sign up, and then you get paired up, and then it's about working out a schedule and a way that works for you. But I think, like with most things, what you put in is what you get out. So when you're looking for a mentor, it's important to first be very clear what you want out of this mentor relationship. And if you are clear what you want, then that increases the probability of you actually getting something out of it.
I think that is a very inspiring spot to finish. Could everyone please join me in thanking our incredible speaker tonight, Dr. Evelyne Deplazes. Thank you so much. And we'll see you all back next month. Please join us for some food and drink.